guys, it's Dani. Welcome to another episode of our Orchid Care series for beginners. Today we will talk all about Orchid Media. We're gonna take a journey through the different types of media you can find on the market. Some of them you probably already know, others maybe not so much. We're gonna talk about the different features of each medium and, of course, which ones are best for which orchids and what type of environments. By the way, if you're newer to my channel, welcome. I hope you'll enjoy this video. If you want to learn more about Phalaenopsis, check the description below. We have an entire series on care all about Phalaenopsis, so feel free to check those out at any time. And of course, today's episode, just like this entire series, is sponsored by Repotme.com, which offers you everything you could possibly need to properly take care of your orchid, from media to fertilizer, pots, and all sorts of accessories. If you're into bonsais, African violets, or even succulents, they do have something for you as well. So I'll link you to them down below. Feel free to check them at any time, because many of the products that I will show you today are actually provided by them. I will actually link you to the products that I will show you down below in the description as well. And with that said, let us start with the different types of media growers commonly use with orchids. So here we have only some of the media available on the market which growers can choose from, and for a beginner it can be a little daunting choosing one which will work with their orchid. The truth is, all of these materials are perfectly suited to grow orchids in. However, they will be more or less ideal for you depending on your environment, the type of orchid you have, and your lifestyle. And figuring out which one will work the best for you, it's a little bit of a trial and error, but I will try to give you a helping hand. So first, let's just start by taking each of these materials, see what it is it good for, and what orchids can benefit from it. Let's start with the most popular medium of all, bark chips. There's a very good reason why bark is amongst the most popular medium orchid growers use, and not only, it is the first choice for beginners as well. In the vast majority of cases, you can use it straight from the bag. You don't need to rinse it or prepare it in any way. And also, it is chunky and airy, which goes very well with most of the orchids we can grow, since most of them are epiphytic. So chances of actually suffocating the roots are minimal with bark. When it's fresh, bark doesn't actually retain much water. Most of the water you will pour through the pot will just simply run out, and whatever will be left inside the pot will just be trapped drops of water. As it ages though, bark can actually retain some water. However, it is actually best to change it when that happens, because water retention in bark simply means breaking down. And when it gets too old, it can become too acidic and too suffocating for orchid roots. So it's best to repot orchids potted in bark every 2, 3, or 4 years, depending how fast the bark breaks down. Bark can actually be of different types. This is Fir Bark, and it's one of the more popular types of bark. Generally speaking, this material is pretty affordable. However, it is a type of bark which breaks down faster. On the market, you can also find better quality types of bark, such as the Orchiata. This bark can be a little bit more expensive, but it is more long-lasting. It is processed differently than the Fir Bark, and in time it will not become so acidic. It will also not break down as fast. So this type of bark is generally more long-lasting than Fir Bark. You can also find different sizes of this material. You can see here that I have a smaller grade and also a bigger grade. Small grade bark tends to hold on to a little bit more water in between the pieces, while bigger chunk bark is a lot more airy and overall doesn't hang on to as much water as smaller grade bark. Both of these materials are good, but they're suited for different types of orchids or different environments. Next very common orchid medium is New Zealand Sphagnum Moss. Although not as popular with orchid beginners, it is a medium preferred by more experienced orchid growers due to its unique qualities. Sphagnum moss is an organic medium which can retain a lot of water. Unlike bark, sphagnum moss retains water in its structure from the beginning, leaving air pockets in between the strains. But not only is it very good at retaining water, it is also very, very wicking. Hence, if we run water through the pot at one end, after a while all of the pot will be evenly moist, because the sphagnum distributes water equally throughout its mass. Because of its qualities, sphagnum moss is a popular choice for very warm or hot environments, for growing spaces which can be very dry, and also for orchids which would rather be moist than dry. Since it is organic, it does break down as well, just like bark, and it needs to be replaced. It generally breaks down faster than bark, but good quality sphagnum moss can actually outlast some bad quality bark. Usually growers repot orchids potted in moss every 1 to 2 or 3 years, depending on environment and how the moss was actually treated. Moss is acidic from the beginning, but as it breaks down, it can become extremely acidic and unsuited for orchids. Furthermore, when working with moss, it is very important not to compress it. Since it's not a stiff material such as bark, it can easily compress and suffocate roots, especially when it's wet. So when potting orchids in moss, it is very important to make the medium very airy and fluffy and not compress it. On the market, you can also find moss being sold compressed, and to use it, you would need to hydrate it. But you can also find uncompressed moss, which doesn't need pre-soaking to be used. Some growers prefer to use coconut husk, which is somewhere in between bark and sphagnum moss. It is chunky just like bark, but it's not as stiff and it can actually retain some water. Since it's an organic material, it does break down in time as well. So orchids potted in coconut husk will need to be repotted every 2, 3, or 4 years, depending how wet the husk remained and how broken down it got. But the major problem with coconut husk is the quantity of salt, particularly if you're using a product which is not designed for orchids or plants specifically. As the name suggests, it derives from coconuts, and coconut trees usually grow near the sea. So the husk needs to be processed very thoroughly in order to remove salt. So with this material, it is always a great idea to use a product intended for orchids. Now for some inorganic media. Here we have perlite. This is a material very similar with sponge rock, and it can come in various sizes. It is a mineral product which does not break down in time. It is not acidic, but it can actually retain some water. Typically, it is not used as a sole medium with orchids, but rather as a filler or an aerator for mixes. Even though it is quite a rigid material, perlite can actually be very brittle, as you can see. Since it is water retentive, one of the downsides of perlite is that it can attract a lot of algae. Also, it can get stained from the tannins contained by the bark or coconut husk, so for aesthetic reasons, it doesn't make for a good top layer. It is a safe medium for orchid roots, but typically it's uncomfortable to use as a sole medium. It is incredibly lightweight, and if the wind blows a little bit too strong, it's gonna fly right out of the pot. You can lose it in your house as well if you walk a little bit too fast with the pot in your hand. Next popular inorganic medium is leca. In some parts of the world, the term hydroton is more popular. Leca is made out of clay, but it is a very porous clay, which makes this material slightly water retentive and absorbent. And because it is a stiff material, it retains air pockets in between the pieces, and it keeps orchids aerated. Depending on the brand, this material can be alkaline, and it needs processing before using. Different brands will have different ways in which they will tell you to process it, but for the main part, soaking it for a predefined period of time in acidified water will prime it for use with orchids. If no prepping is required, this material will still need to be rinsed, because in transport and just as it sits, clay will just fall off of each bead and it will create dust. And this dust can actually fill the air pockets and also the drainage holes of your pots. So it's a very good idea to rinse this material before use. Leca can be used on its own in a setup called semi-hydroponics, but many of the times we can find it in mixes. It does a very good job at aerating the mix and keeping air pockets available for the roots. Since it's inorganic, it will not break down and it will not change its shape in time. So even if the organic medium around it will start to break down, the leca will still be there in the mix to provide some aeration. This medium can also be reused, but it's a good idea to sterilize it through boiling or through high temperatures before use. And the last inorganic material we're gonna look at is lava rock. This is not a clay material, it is natural rock. It is porous, but as you can see, it does have an irregular shape. Typically, this is a pretty neutral material, which is not very water retentive, but being that it's porous, it can actually store a little bit of water in its pores. Usually it is not used as a sole medium, but rather in mixes to keep them more aerated, similarly to leca. Lava rock needs to be rinsed before use, but it's not necessary to prepare it or soak it in water or anything of the sorts. But since it's a porous rock, it is prone to creating a little bit of dust. And this can actually clog up the ventilation or drainage holes of your pot. So all of this media we looked at today is actually suited for orchids, but these materials will not perform the same depending on your environment mainly and the type of orchid you have. For this reason, the majority of orchid growers actually make a mix of various materials in order to obtain a perfect balance of airiness and water retention. And as it just so happens, Repotme is actually famous for their orchid mixes. As the name suggests, they know what they're doing when it comes to mixes. So now let's take the most popular orchids and see what type of mixes are more suited for them depending on environment. First off, Phalaenopsis orchids. These are epiphytic plants which enjoy a lot of ventilation around their root system. They're also very drought tolerant. So usually a mix for these orchids will mainly consist of very airy media such as bark chips. They can be big or small in size, and typically for average home conditions, bark will do a fantastic job as a sole medium or combined with other airy materials. However, in homes which are rather dry or environment is rather warm, bark can actually be mixed with sphagnum moss. The combination of the two will give an airy but a water-retentive environment. Coconut husk can work just as well because it's chunky but can retain a little bit of water. Repotme actually has 3 types of Phalaenopsis mixes, which cater to the different types of environments you grow your orchids in. I actually made a video about those mixes and I tested them last year. I'll link you the video down below. But as you will see, the 3 mixes will vary from very, very airy and less water retentive to half and half, if you will, to more water retentive, a mix that has a lot more sphagnum moss in its composition together with airing materials. So if you're a beginner with orchids, pre-made mixes can actually be a good choice. But of course, mixing your own mix is absolutely fine as well. Then we have Cattleya orchids. These types of orchids like a lot of ventilation around their root system and are extremely drought tolerant, even more so than Phalaenopsis. Usually Cattleya mixes are very chunky and not so water retentive. So depending on environment, big or small great bark can do just fine, and mixes with leca and even lava rock can work absolutely great without the addition of sphagnum moss. For typical homes, an airy mix is usually best because temperatures are typically intermediate. The mix that Repotme has for Cattleyas is a very, very airy mix, as you can see, and it should work perfect for any type of Cattleya orchid. However, being that Cattleyas can actually tolerate extreme heat, some growers grow their orchids outside during summer, case in which a medium consisting of airy materials but also water-retentive materials can work out just great. However, though, with Cattleyas, sphagnum moss is not the go-to material. It is a safer choice to go for the airier materials. Dendrobium-type orchids will prefer similar things to Cattleyas. They are very warmth-tolerant as well and enjoy having a lot of ventilation around their roots. So mixes containing bark, cocoa husk, lava rock, or leca are very common for these types of orchids. Depending where you're actually growing your orchid, sometimes adding a little bit of sphagnum moss can help, but typically for these orchids, in a home environment, the airier the better, just like with Cattleyas. When it comes to Oncidium orchids, things are quite different. These orchids don't really appreciate drought, and as much as they do still enjoy aeration, they do prefer to be rather damp than dry. So a good medium for them can be small grade bark, coconut husk, or even sphagnum moss. To these mixes we can add a little bit of perlite or other airing materials, but a medium such as big chunky bark pieces might not be suitable for too many homes. The Repotme mix for Oncidiums, which I did try out, is made out of turfus and small grade Orchiata bark, and it is actually working fabulous. I really like it because it does tend to stay rather moist and it is still very airy, which is very suitable for beginners. When it comes to Paphiopedilums and other slipper orchids, we want a medium which is airy, but one that can actually hold on to a little bit of water. So mixes between smaller grade bark, perlite, or coconut husk are very common. I actually tested out the slipper medium from Repot Me and I really like the results. It has a medium type of water retention, which I find really suited for home conditions. But if your environment tends to be unusually dry or warm, I would definitely put just a little bit of sphagnum moss in the mix, because these orchids don't really appreciate staying way too dry. Their roots will not grow in the air and they will not appreciate drought. For terrestrial orchids such as cymbidiums, ludicias, psychopetalums, and others, mixing peat moss with a little bit of bark and perlite and other airing materials can actually work out great. And I recently tried out the cymbidium mix from Repot Me, and my cymbidium is really loving it. But at the same time, we can use a mixture between bark and sphagnum moss. These orchids don't really appreciate drought all that much, but still require a great deal of airiness in their medium. Since these can actually be garden orchids, we can opt for something quite fine, but it is important to have aerating materials as well. And now that you know a little bit about all of these different media, I hope you have a better idea and understanding about how orchid media work and why we have so many of them and why so many people use so many different media with success. And that is about it for today. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Down below you will find a link to Repot Me, who has other types of media which I didn't present today. The best thing to do is to read the description and see what each of these media do, and also check out their pre-made mixes as well, because they are really fabulous. And with that said, thank you Repot Me for making this series possible. Thank you guys for watching. Hope you have a great weekend, and you know the drill. Like or dislike this video below. Subscribe for more orchid tutorials, experiments, and product reviews. And also follow me on Instagram and Facebook as well for even more orchid information. And with that said, I'll see you next time. Bye!